Imagine being handed the fastest aircraft in the world, knowing that before a single enemy bullet is fired at you, the machine itself is already trying to kill you, not through mechanical failure, not through bad weather, but through the fuel running through its veins, a liquid so violently unstable that it could dissolve your skin, eat through concrete, and explode without warning. This was the reality for every pilot who climbed into the Messerschmitt ME-163 Comet, the world's first operational rocket-powered fighter. A machine that could climb faster than anything the Allies had ever seen, and kill its own pilots just as efficiently as it killed its enemies. By 1944, Germany was desperate. Allied bombers were crossing the skies over the Reich almost unopposed at high altitude, and every conventional interceptor Germany had was too slow to catch them before they dropped their payloads and turned for home. The Luftwaffe needed something radically different. What they got was the Comet, a tailless, swept-wing rocket plane capable of reaching 960 kilometers per hour. For context, the best Allied fighters of the time were pushing around 680. The Me-163 didn't just close the performance gap, it erased it entirely. On paper, it looked like the weapon that could change the air war. In practice, it was a coffin with wings that happened to fly faster than anything in history. To understand why the Comet was so dangerous to its own pilots, you have to understand what was burning inside it. The Walter HWK 509 rocket engine ran on two separate propellants that were stored in tanks within the fuselage, positioned disturbingly close to the pilot's seat. The first was called Seestoff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol. The second was T-Stoff, and T-Stoff is where the story turns genuinely horrifying. T-Stoff was a highly concentrated solution of hydrogen peroxide, at 80 to 90% concentration. To put that in perspective, the hydrogen peroxide you might use to clean a wound is 3%. What was pumping through the Comet's fuel lines was nearly 30 times more concentrated than that. At that concentration, hydrogen peroxide is not just an oxidizer. It is an extraordinarily aggressive chemical that reacts violently with almost any organic material it contacts. And organic material is exactly what a human body is made of. When T-Stoff came into contact with skin, it didn't burn in the way fire burns. It oxidized tissue at a cellular level. Pilots and ground crews who were splashed with even small amounts described the sensation as immediate and total. The skin would first turn white as the chemical began destroying the outer layers, then blister, then begin to disintegrate. There are documented cases of ground crew members who were soaked in T-Stoff spills and died not from explosion, not from fire, but from the chemical consuming them from the outside in. The compound didn't need a spark, it didn't need heat, it just needed contact. The two propellants, Seestoff and T-Stoff, were kept separate for obvious reasons, because when they mixed, they reacted hypergolically. That word means they ignited spontaneously on contact with each other, with no ignition source required whatsoever. No spark plug, no flame, no trigger. The moment the two liquids touched, combustion happened. This was by design. It was actually what drove the engine, but inside a damaged aircraft or during a crash landing, or simply through a cracked fuel line vibrating at high speed, that same chemistry became a death sentence. If the fuselage fractured and the two tanks ruptured together, the pilot didn't have time to register what was happening. The explosion was immediate, total, and left almost nothing behind. Ground crews working around the Comet operated under rules that sound less like aviation protocol and more like instructions for handling a biological weapon. Full protective suits were mandatory. Any skin exposure was treated as an emergency. The aprons, gloves, and boots used around T-Stoff were made from specialized materials because standard rubber degraded on contact with the compound. Tools had to be cleaned obsessively because residual traces of one propellant could react with the other hours later. The fuel lines themselves had to be flushed with water after every flight because T-Stoff residue sitting in a warm metal tube would eventually find something to react with. Everything about the ground handling of this aircraft communicated the same message. This machine is trying to kill everyone near it, not just the people it's aimed at. Now add to this the takeoff. The Mi-163 did not take off on a conventional undercarriage. To save weight and reduce drag, engineers gave it a dolly, a wheeled trolley that it sat on during the ground roll and simply dropped away once airborne. What this meant in practice was that a pilot was accelerating down a runway at speeds approaching 300 kilometers per hour, sitting on a detachable cart with tanks full of chemicals that could dissolve him, pointed at an angle where any deviation meant immediate catastrophe, and with no landing gear to speak of for when he came back down. The takeoff itself was violent. The Walter rocket engine pushed the aircraft from standstill to liftoff in approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds during which the pilot experienced acceleration forces that compressed them into their seat, during which any fuel line problem would result in explosion beneath them, and during which the dolly had to separate cleanly or the entire aircraft would cartwheel down the runway. Several pilots were killed or severely injured during takeoff runs alone, before they ever reached altitude. The dolly occasionally bounced on rough runway surfaces and struck the aircraft from below. In at least one recorded incident, the dolly rebounded after separation and hit the aircraft hard enough to damage the fuselage. There was also the very real problem that the rocket engine, producing that enormous thrust, could not be throttled with precision in early variants. You were either burning or you weren't. There was no gentle acceleration, no easing into it. You committed fully from the moment the engine lit, and you held on. The climb was where the aircraft performed its most spectacular and terrifying trick. The Comet could reach 12,000 meters in under 4 minutes. 4 minutes from the runway to combat altitude. Allied bomber crews who first encountered it described something that looked less like an aircraft and more like a missile with a cockpit, climbing vertically through their formations before they had time to react. But that performance came with a brutal constraint. At full power, the Comet carried enough fuel for approximately 8 minutes of powered flight. 8 minutes. After that, the engine stopped, the rocket went silent, and what had been the fastest aircraft in the sky became a glider. A very fast glider, still capable of around 200 kilometers per hour in unpowered glide, but completely defenseless, completely dependent on the pilot finding a landing strip quickly and completely at the mercy of whatever the landing itself brought. And the landing is where the Comet killed most of its pilots. Coming in on the retractable skid that replaced the landing gear, without the dolly, the pilot had one attempt. There was no going around for a second approach. The skid created enormous friction on contact with the ground, which generated heat, which is a catastrophic problem when the aircraft's fuel tanks, even partially drained, still contained residual T-stoff and C-stoff. Any hard landing, any bounce, any deviation that caused the fuselage to flex sharply risked fracturing those tanks. And fractured tanks meant mixing propellants. And mixing propellants meant the hypergolic reaction that needed no spark, no flame, nothing except contact. Pilots who survived combat in the Comet and enemy fire and the 8-minute fuel window often died in the final 15 seconds of the landing roll because the aircraft's own chemistry detonated beneath them on touchdown. There was another phenomenon that haunted the landing approach specifically. Because the Comet came in so fast compared to conventional aircraft, Allied fighters quickly learned that the most vulnerable moment for a Comet pilot was during final approach to land. Slower, unpowered, committed to a single landing path, the aircraft was essentially defenseless. Allied pilots began patrolling the airspace around known Comet bases, waiting for that window. German commanders responded by positioning conventional fighters to escort returning Comets on approach. The fastest aircraft in the world needed a babysitter during its most dangerous minutes because it was too committed to its own lethal chemistry to defend itself. Pilots who flew the Comet regularly described a specific psychological burden that went beyond the ordinary fear of combat. It was the awareness that the danger was not in front of them. It was underneath them, behind them, soaking into the airframe around them. Enemy guns at least had a direction you could evade. The T-Staff didn't care which way you banked. Veterans described performing pre-flight checks with the awareness that they were essentially inspecting whether the aircraft had decided to kill them yet today. Some pilots refused additional assignments to the aircraft after their first flights, accepting reassignment to conventional units despite the performance gap, because the psychological weight of flying inside a chemical reaction was something they simply could not sustain. Of the roughly 300 Me-163s produced, only about a dozen Allied aircraft were confirmed destroyed in combat operations. For all its extraordinary speed and climb performance, the Comet's combat effectiveness was deeply limited by that 8-minute fuel window, by the difficulty of aiming at such high closing speeds, and by the vulnerability during approach. The Germans lost far more aircraft and pilots to the machine itself than to any enemy action. Structural failures, fuel explosions, landing accidents, and chemical casualties among ground crews combined to make the Comet one of the most statistically dangerous aircraft ever to enter operational service, measured not by what it faced, but by what it did to its own side. There is something deeply revealing about the Me-163 as a piece of history. It arrived at the absolute cutting edge of what human engineering could achieve in 1944, pushing into realms of speed and propulsion that genuinely pointed toward the future of aviation. The swept-wing design directly influenced jet aircraft developed for decades afterward. The fundamental principles of the Walter rocket motor fed into post-war aerospace research across multiple nations. The technology was real, it was visionary, and in a different context it might have been celebrated purely as a triumph of engineering. But the fuel that made it fly could dissolve the hands of the men who fueled it. The speed that made it untouchable by the enemy made it almost unlandable by its pilot. The chemistry that ignited without a spark could detonate without warning inside a damaged airframe. The Comet was a machine that demanded everything from the men who flew it and returned nothing, resembling safety in exchange. It killed through contact, through explosion, through speed, and through the simple fact that the technology had outrun any reasonable understanding of how to survive it. The pilots who climbed into it knew this. They climbed in anyway, and that, more than the speed records and the swept wings and the rocket exhaust burning white against the European sky, is what makes the story of the Me-163 Comet genuinely impossible to forget.